Hi everybody, and welcome to Movie Recaps with Brit. Today we will be looking at a movie titled A Little Princess. Without further ado, let's get started. The film starts with Gong Ju following Dong Wan, a social worker, while carrying her younger sister, Jin Ju, on her back. Don Wang helps Gong Ju in searching for their grandmother. After they arrive at a house, Don Wang instructs the little girl to wait outside and walks away. Miss Bayon, an elderly woman, arrives and sees the sleeping girl. She asks questions about the little girl's identity and notices her carrying a plastic bag. Miss Bayon suspects the girl of stealing the bag, and demands to see its contents. Gong Ju asserts that she owns the polythene bag and refuses to give it to Mrs. Bayon, who then tries to pull it from her, resulting in it falling and making a loud noise. Gong Ju quickly opens the bag and realizes that the urn inside is broken. She is devastated since the urn belonged to her mother, Kim Ho-shan. Upon seeing the name, Miss Bayon is shocked to learn that Kim was her daughter, who left her to pursue a career as a singer in the city but never came back home. Consequently, Gong Ju and Jin Ju start living with their grandmother. In the following scene, Gong Ju starts going to school and meets a boy named Yuran. He approaches her and asks to be friends. When one of their classmates, Wang Suk, sees this, she becomes jealous and bullies Gong Ju after school. Despite this, Gong Ju stands her ground and fights back by headbutting Wang Suk's nose, causing her to bleed. After the incident, Gong Ju warns all the bullies and leaves. Yuram is impressed by her courage and admires her for standing up to the bullies, as he has never seen anyone do that before. Over time, Mrs. Bayon develops a fondness for her two grandchildren and enjoys their company. Financially, she is struggling due to having 2 additional mouths to feed, but she tries to maintain a positive attitude and not let it affect the children. Gong Ju also does her best to help her grandmother in any way she can, strengthening their relationship with each passing day. The following day, Yuram finds out that Gong Ju has an interest in photography, so he asks to borrow her camera for a few days. He then lets Gong Ju take pictures of him, which makes her happy. During gym class, Gong Ju is unable to participate because she doesn't have a gym uniform and is placed in a separate class. While there, she sees a classmate named Jeong-suk's purse and takes it without permission. In the following sequence, Jeong-suk reports her lost purse to the teacher, and everyone assumes Gong Ju is the culprit as she was the only one in the classroom. Consequently, the teacher calls for a meeting with Jeong-suk's parents and Mrs. Bayon to address the issue. During the discussion, Jeong-suk's mother accuses Gong Ju of theft, which triggers a heated argument between her and Mrs. Bayon. However, Yuran intervenes by presenting the purse to Jeong-suk's mother, explaining that Jeong-suk left it on the ground while playing hide and seek. During the evening, Gong Ju meets Yuram and inquires if he is taken aback by her actions. Yuram declines criticizing her, as he isn't cognizant of her economic circumstances. He then inquires if Gong Ju intended to buy a gym uniform with the stolen money, but Gong Ju clarifies that she only wished to purchase new glasses for her grandmother because her only other pair were damaged. Gong Ju breaks down in tears, and Yuram snaps a picture of her and attempts to comfort her. Later in the night, Gong Ju and Mrs. Bayon engage in a fun game. Though they enjoy themselves at first, Gong Ju eventually discloses that Hokkien is actually her stepmother. Mrs. Bayon's delight fades upon hearing this revelation, and she admits that she was already aware of this fact. She then asks Gong Ju if she holds any resentment towards her stepmother. Gong Ju responds by stating that despite her stepmother causing her pain, she has always been there for them, especially after her father's death. After making this emotional statement, Mrs. Bayon reassures Gong Ju that she will always treat her grandchildren with equality and never discriminate against them. On the following day, Mrs. Bayon and Gong Ju accompanied Jin Ju to the clinic for her vaccination. While at the clinic, Gong Ju inquires with the nurse about the quality of free vaccines, causing Mrs. Bayon to rush over and stop her, inadvertently leaving Jin Ju alone on the bench. Tragically, Jin Ju falls and bleeds from her nose. A nurse then takes her away for a thorough examination and notices multiple bruises on her stomach, prompting her to contact Dr. Zhang, the nurse's husband, for a second opinion. However, Dr. Jian fails to provide a definitive diagnosis. A few moments pass, and Mrs. Bayon experiences confusion and forgetfulness. In response, Gong Ju carries Jin Ju on her back and guides Mrs. Bayon back home. The following day at school, Gong Ju is praised by her classmates for crafting a beautifully written story about her family. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bayon plays cards with her friends, but an argument breaks out when one of them accuses her of cheating. Unbeknownst to her friends, Mrs. Bayon is suffering from dementia. Gong Ju learns of the argument and quickly intervenes to resolve the issue before returning her grandmother home. Mrs. Bayon inquires if Gong Ju and Jin Ju can be left alone, fearing that her presence may negatively affect the child. However, Gong Ju refuses to be separated and convinces her grandmother that she will take care of both of them. One day, due to Mrs. Bayon's carelessness, Jin Ju's hands get injured, and Gong Ju takes her to the hospital. Dr. Jiang suggests that Jin Ju be admitted for a few days. At home, Mrs. Bayon feels bad, thinking that she is the problem, and requests Dong to find someone else to care for her grandchildren before things get worse. She requested that he persuade Gong Ju to send Jin Ju away, and find someone else to take care of the children. Meanwhile, Gong Ju is still at the hospital looking after her little sister. At home, while preparing Gong Ju's dinner, Mrs. Baiyun forgets the lunchbox in the kitchen. She goes to retrieve it but forgets about Gong Ju and ends up eating all the food alone. Later, she wakes up and gets angry with herself for not leaving any food for Gong Ju. She then visits the same friend she previously fought with, and gets a tattoo of her grandchildren's names on her hands to help her remember them. Dr. Jiang contemplates adopting Jin Ju while they are at the hospital since she reminds him of his deceased daughter who passed away young. Meanwhile, Gong Ju eavesdrops on a nurse discussing Jin Ju's medical condition and the fact that Dr. Jiang is paying for all of her medical bills. She realizes that Jin Ju's treatment is costly and reluctantly decides to do what is best for her sister, by agreeing to send her to the doctor's care. Before departing, she requests one favor from them, to provide her grandmother with a new pair of glasses. In the following scene, Gong Ju comes back home holding the new glasses, and agrees with her grandmother's decision to send Jin Ju to the doctor. Mrs. Baiyun becomes emotional while observing this. The next day, as they have breakfast, Mrs. Baiyun is still worried that she might hurt her granddaughter. Therefore, she intentionally picks a fight with Gong Ju and demands that she leave the house. She even uses half dialect to make herself appear more villainous than Gong Ju's stepmother. During the argument, she bites Gong Ju's hand, hoping to force her to leave. However, Gong Ju remains firm in her decision to stay. At the same time, Dong arrives and urges Gong Ju to attend school. Mrs. Baiyun weeps in despair after Gong Ju departs. In a desperate attempt to alleviate her remorse, she bites herself as she did Gong Ju. On her way home from school, Gong Ju is greeted by Dr. Jiang, who invites her to dine, and discloses that Jin Ju is going to the United States for advanced treatment. Gong Ju returns home to discover that her grandmother has packed her bags to leave. Gong Ju manages to persuade her grandmother to stay, but Mrs. Baiyun starts a quarrel, expressing her desire to live separately from Gong Ju. Once the old grandmother feels composed, Gong Ju helps her to wash her hair. The grandma discloses that she will be admitted to a mental health institution, where she won't pose any threat to others. She expresses her gratitude to Gong Ju for taking good care of her, but now she feels that it's time for Gong Ju to focus on her own well-being. The grandma adds that she doesn't want to be a source of trouble anymore. This revelation brings tears to Gong Ju's eyes. Gong Ju was left heartbroken when Mrs. Baiyun departed without even saying goodbye. In the subsequent scene, Gong Ju visits Dr. Jiang's residence, where he and his spouse express their interest in adopting her too. Gong Ju agrees to live with them as her grandmother prefers to stay alone. She moves in with the doctor and his wife, and is treated with great care. However, Gong Ju still longs for her grandmother and misses her deeply, even as time passes. Eventually, she decides to pay her grandmother a visit at the nursing home. It takes her a while to find her, but she eventually does, sitting by herself, weaving handkerchiefs. As Gong Ju approaches her grandmother, she is taken aback to realize that the old lady no longer remembers her. Mrs. Baiyun's dementia has progressed to a stage where she cannot recognize even the most familiar faces. Observing her grandmother's state, Gong Ju begins to sob uncontrollably. When Mrs. Baiyun inquires if Gong Ju has lost her parents, Gong Ju responds by saying that she has lost her grandmother. The old lady then comforts her by assuring her that she will assist in locating Gong Ju's grandmother. On the following day, Gong Ju departs from Dr. Jiang's home and leaves behind a letter addressed to the couple. In the letter, she assures them that she and her grandmother will stay resilient while Jin Ju recuperates. Gong Ju further expresses her willingness to do anything in her power to create meaningful and cherished moments with her grandmother. Time passes, and the days turn into weeks, while the weeks turn into months. Eventually, Gong Ju and her grandmother have returned to their former home, and Mrs. Baiyun is spending her final moments there. One day, she reveals to Gong Ju that she has created a muffler for both her and Jin Ju, and shares her delight at having grandchildren as wonderful as them. She goes on to describe how Gong Ju and Jin Ju have brought immense happiness into her life. The two of them hug each other tightly, but sadly, Mrs. Baiyun passes away at that very moment. Gong Ju lies beside her grandmother's body and sheds tears, thanking her for being a part of her life. Several years go by, and Gong Ju grows up to become a renowned photographer. One day, a woman wearing a muffler identical to Gong Ju's approaches her. The woman shows Gong Ju her muffler and reveals that she has been searching for her. Gong Ju soon realizes that the woman is her long-lost sister, Jin Ju. Overwhelmed with emotions, the sisters embrace each other tightly. The film concludes as Gong Ju expresses her gratitude to her late grandmother for the muffler that served as a symbol for their reunion. Thank you for watching our movie recap. While it may seem simple, it actually took a lot of hard work and dedication to produce. If you enjoyed the video, we kindly ask you to show your support by liking and subscribing to our channel. By doing so, you'll stay updated on our latest content and help us continue creating more in-depth analyses and critiques of the movies you love. Thank you again for your support.